Previously riding the Öhlins RXF38 for a few weeks, unable to find a shock to match that fork. So today we're going to look at the Öhlins TTX air shock. So I'm not particularly sure what stroke this shock comes in. It says 230 by 60 and it looks like it comes with a couple of travel reducers inside of the box, but the stroke doesn't really matter. It's a 230 enduro shock, so let's take a look at it. Pop an Excalibur out of the box. So she sits somewhere between a Fox Float X and a Fox Float X2. So Öhlins knows how to do things right. This is the largest air shock you can get from Öhlins in 230 by 65. Because if you have a longer stroke than that, you should probably be on a coil shock. Let's clear some stuff up. This is a TTX2Air shock. It features a double foreskin and a larger air chambers. So this shock's going to be a little bit more plush than the TTX1. So I paid a hefty penalty to get the TTX2 while Jensen has the TTX1 on heavy discount. According to Öhlins, the TTX1 is a more progressive air can. So if you have a rubbish specialized rear suspension, you're going to want to go for the TTX1 according to Öhlins. And if you have a progressive frame, you're going to go for the TTX2. But my personal opinion is always go for the larger air cans, so they're just going to feel more plush and just better in my opinion. So let's jump into those clickers and clackers. I'm pretty sure TTX1 and TTX2 have the same clicker, clackers, bladders, compression damper assembly. So let me tell you about the high-speed compression adjust on the TTX Air. So it says 1, 2, 3, but think about it like this. Number 1 is like full open high-speed compression. Number 2 is a stiff high-speed compression. And number 3 is somewhat of a pedaling platform, but I'm gonna have to talk about that later. Checking out her backside in the dark. So we have the low speed compression adjust and it has about 10 clicks on that side and 10 clicks of rebound. So do not focus on the clicker clackers. All you gotta know is Öhlins does the most effective use of adjustments in the entire mountain bike suspension market. So where's my weight weenies at? Because she comes in at 1 pound and 1 ounces. And if you're an old school millennial, that's 500 grams or 520 sacks. To put this into suspension perspective, a cheap $40 Fox coil weighs 500 grams. The only thing that's going to come in your box is a whole bunch of Lego blocks. And these look like volume reducers and stroke reducers, and unfortunately you need a bottom bracket tool to open this shock up, so I didn't even bother. So Öhlins uses the same style of DU bushings or whatever you call it as Fox, and that's probably because they're the easiest, the cheapest, and the most user-friendly to use. I still have to attach these stupid bearing mounts to make it work on the Rocky Mountain, but let's get her pumped into the bike. Put this into perspective. I bought this bike because it's coil friendly. This $400 Sun Tour coil is better than the Öhlins air shock. So you can skip this video and just go buy a coil shock and you'll have a better day. Houston, we have a problem. So this is a brand new air shock. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a used one, so I got a new one. So not even Öhlins is immune to air shock bullshit. So essentially the shock is topping out, and what usually happens is you didn't inflate the shock correctly and the negative chamber didn't get filled up, and it'll give you this horrible clunk. What you have to do is basically deflate the shock, pump it 50 psi, press it down into the travel, and I didn't go into the techno jargon, I'm just basing that off the Fox Float X2 and the RockShox Vivid top out conditions that are pretty common when you're setting the shock up. The bummer part of this is you get a 10-minute pumping session and my right hand gets enough exercise as is. Just to make sure I didn't fuck anything up, I did read the user manual and there's absolutely no useful information in the user manual. So what you need to do is basically look on Reddit or find some idiot on YouTube like myself who's solved this problem. What I want you to know is not a full-size Chevy truck like a RockShox Vivid. This is definitely Enduro Light. After a long stroking pumping session with the air pump and equalizing the chambers like you're supposed to, I guess, I just decided to set the sag and go ride it with the top out condition still occurring. So later that day I thought maybe it would fix itself, and definitely not, but I'm just gonna go ride it anyway. So I will save you the 20-minute bumbling session, but I can tell you I could not feel any top out when I was basically riding this on the trail. So let's talk about some super highlights of the TTX Air I did discover on the first little test ride. So this is the shock with the compression, the high-speed compression in the full open setting. So it's definitely a bobber. Bob, bob, bob. So this doesn't really matter if you're on an e-bike, but if you're on an Amish bike, it's pretty important to have a climb lever. So let's take a look at this Öhlins AirShock in number 3, basically the climb mode. It is not fully locked out, but it's definitely super firm. Not much adjustment period, the stuff just works really good, but you do have to have the shock and the fork. I spent a couple weeks on that fork, put a couple different shocks on it, and could not get it right. Putting the Öhlins AirShock into the mix, everything was absolutely dialed within like 20 minutes. There's no massive adjustment period, like jumping over from a Fox to a RockShox. The Öhlins TTX AirShock experience is one of a kind. Basically, the ramp up was absolutely perfectly dialed straight out of the box. Every single other AirShock I've ever used, it took like 2 to 3 openings of the AirShock and adding tokens in. So while I was doing my little YouTube research, I watched this guy's video, and this shock comes with a whole bunch of spacers in it from the factory. Every other brand on the market should be doing this as well, because they basically got the ramp up absolutely dialed for my super progressive frame. So I did discover one unique thing that happened during that ride. Basically, the top out condition that was happening before the ride was completely fixed, and the pressure went from 270 down to 240. So I went back out to the test track with 270 in the shock, and the experience was absolutely rubbish. So I actually liked the way it rode better with like 40% sag and lower pressure. Taking the TTX AirShock into some tech trails, let's see how she does. Is she all mountain princess or is she an enduro champ? So learn this from me here, guys. Don't ride coil shocks all summer, and then when it starts raining, put an AirShock on your bike, because that's just dumb. So the TTX AirShock does have a bladder inside of the piggyback, and if you've watched my videos before, I will rant and rave and say bladders are better than any internal floating piston. But flipping this around when it comes to AirShocks, I don't really see that much of a benefit. So the damping inside the TTX is absolutely world class. Like, it is definitely the best or one of the best damp shocks on the market. So this could come down to the bladder situation again. Basically, the bladder allows for smoother transition between compression and rebound. While the damping is truly impressive on the TTX2, let's dive into the air spring, my perception of it on a Rudy wet tech trail. So this is truly an impressive air spring, and I hate air shocks. So what it does, it basically, you can watch it here, it just hovers around in the mid-stroke, absorbing the bumps precisely how you want it to. It doesn't pack down, it doesn't turn into a wall of resistance. It is the absolutely perfectly ideal air spring I've ever felt. But let's remember, this is still an air spring that lacks quite a bit of traction. I was slipping and sliding all the way down this trail. Everything in suspension is a compromise while I'm slipping away down this tech trail. This shock does have a lot of liveliness and poppiness coming out of it. It's definitely more reactive than a Fox Float X2, and definitely better damped than a RockShox Vivid. So at the bottom of this trail, turns into some blue flow trails, but unfortunately it's so slippery, I could barely ride them. But I can tell you from my limited time on the TTX2 and the blue flow trails, that excellent air can is an absolutely excellent jumper, and that comes from a pretty mediocre rider, so you can take that with some seriousness. After riding this setup for nearly a month or so, I realized the TTX2 is more in line with the Fox Float X. Definitely far superior with its high-speed compression and better damping. But that means I didn't find the right match for the RXF 38. But if you click this video on their screen, it is the correct match.